We begin, as we always do, with a name that history nearly forgot, and a debt that took 30 years to come due. Elias Bonner had buried his wife in April, lost his last acre of wheat ground to the bank in June, and by the second week of August he owned nothing in this world but a mule, a canvas bedroll, and $4.60 wrapped in a handkerchief inside his coat. He had once been a man other men in Cedar Hollow, Kansas, tipped their hats to, a wheelwright and sometime farmer whose word was worth more than most men's signatures. Now he was simply a man standing at the edge of a county auction, watching strangers bid away the last remnants of other people's ruined lives, wondering if there was anything left in this world cheap enough for a man with almost nothing to buy. When the auctioneer, half bored, called out the final lot of the day, a collapsing, forgotten barn on the old Alcott place, condemned by the county and slated for the wrecking crew, Elias raised his hand before he had even decided to, and bought it for $5, a sum so small the auctioneer laughed and called it charity. Everyone in that dusty yard thought Elias Bonner had finally lost what little sense grief had left him. They did not know that beneath the rotted floorboards of that worthless barn lay a secret buried deep enough and old enough to change not only the fortune of one broken man, but the conscience of an entire town that had spent 30 years pretending it had no debts left to pay. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Elias Bonner. If you find comfort in stories where forgotten things turn out to hold more worth than anyone imagined, we invite you to stay with us a while. Elias had not always been a man who owned nothing. He had been raised 20 miles east of Cedar Hollow, on a modest homestead his father cleared with an axe and a stubbornness that ran in the family like a second bloodline. His father, Thomas Bonner, had come west from Ohio in the years just after the war, carrying little more than a set of blacksmithing tools and a conviction, hard-won and quietly held, that a man's worth was measured by what he built and what he kept his word about, not by what he was born owning. Elias grew up in the ring of the forge and the smell of scorched iron, learning at his father's elbow how to read the temper of hot metal the way other boys learned to read scripture, with patience, with reverence, and with the understanding that haste ruined more good work than any other single failing. It was from his father, too, that Elias learned the value of things other people discarded. Thomas Bonner had a habit, one the neighbors found peculiar and occasionally worth teasing him over, of buying broken wagon wheels, cracked plowshares, and bent horseshoes from farmers who considered them worthless, paying pennies for scrap that Elias later watched his father reforge into tools sharper and truer than anything sold new in the county store. Nothing is finished being useful, his father used to say, wiping soot from his hands with the same rag he'd used for 20 years, until somebody decides it is. Elias carried that lesson the way other men carried their father's pocket watches, not as an heirloom to be admired, but as a working instrument, checked against daily. He married Sarah Whitfield when he was 23 in a small clapboard church that smelled of new pine and old hymnals, and for 11 years they built a life together on a modest quarter section of wheat ground just south of Cedar Hollow. Sarah was a schoolteacher's daughter, sharp-minded and gentle-voiced, the kind of woman who kept careful ledgers of the household accounts not out of anxiety, but out of a genuine belief that order was a form of kindness, to herself, to her husband, and to whatever children God saw fit to send them. They never had children, a sorrow they carried privately and rarely spoke of, but they had each other, and they had the particular contentment of two people who had built something modest and honest with their own hands. Elias ran a small wheelwright shop in town, mending wagon wheels and fitting iron rims with the same careful attention his father had taught him, while Sarah taught piano to the daughters of Cedar Hollow's more prosperous families and kept their little house so clean and orderly that visitors often remarked it seemed larger than it was. They were not wealthy, not by the standards of the bankers and grain merchants who had begun arriving in Cedar Hollow with the railroad in the early 80s, but they were secure, and in a frontier town where security was rarer than gold, that counted for a great deal. It was Sarah who first taught Elias to see value in what the town had begun to overlook. Cedar Hollow, like many prairie towns built fast on railroad money, had a habit of forgetting its own history the moment it became inconvenient to remember. The town's original settlement, decades before the railroad came through, had included a modest community of free black families, farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen, who had come west in the years following the war seeking the kind of independence the eastern states had been slow to grant them. Chief among them had been a blacksmith named Josiah Alcott, a formidable, quiet man who had, according to the older residents Sarah used to visit on her piano teaching rounds, once run a station on what remained of the underground network that had helped fugitives reach freedom before the war's end, and who after the war had used his considerable skill and his considerable savings to help other freed families establish themselves on land west of the Missouri. Sarah had grown fond of an elderly widow named Mrs. Odom, one of the last living residents who remembered the Alcott family firsthand, and from her Sarah had gathered fragments of a story that most of Cedar Hollow's newer residents had never heard at all, that Josiah Alcott had once owned a substantial parcel of land at the edge of town, that he had built a barn there sturdier and finer than almost any structure in the county, and that sometime in the 1870s, under circumstances Mrs. Odom would only describe as dealings nobody wanted to look at too closely, the Alcott family had lost that land and scattered, their names slowly erased from the town's public memory the way a footprint erases from wind-blown sand. Sarah had found the story troubling in a way she could never fully articulate, and she had told it to Elias more than once, usually on quiet evenings when the lamp burned low and the prairie wind pressed against the windows. "Somebody in this town knows what really happened to that family," she used to say, "and somebody has decided it's easier not to remember." Elias had listened to these stories the way he listened to most things Sarah said, carefully and without forgetting them, even if their meaning did not become clear to him until many years later, in circumstances neither of them could have imagined. The trouble that eventually consumed Elias's life began not with any single catastrophe, but with the slow, grinding arithmetic of bad years compounding on worse ones. The drought that struck the county in the mid-'80s was not the kind that made for dramatic headlines. No dust storms blotting out the sun, no biblical devastation, but a patient, punishing dryness that thinned the wheat year after year until the ground itself seemed to have given up hoping for rain. Elias's wheelwright trade suffered alongside the farms it served, because a man cannot pay to mend a wagon wheel when he has no crop to haul in it. He had taken a mortgage against his shop and his small house 3 years earlier, a modest loan from the newly established Cedar Hollow Farmers and Merchants Bank, believing, as most men in town believed, that the bank existed to help hard-working families weather exactly this kind of lean season. The bank's president, a smooth, ambitious man named Nathaniel Pruitt who had arrived in Cedar Hollow only a handful of years earlier and had risen with startling speed to become the town's most powerful citizen, had personally assured Elias that the loan carried generous terms and that the bank took a long view of its neighbors' fortunes. Elias believed him, the way honest men often believe smooth ones, because it did not occur to him that a man could smile so warmly while quietly calculating exactly how much of another man's life he might eventually come to own. The fever that took Sarah arrived in the bitter cold of the following January, moving through Cedar Hollow the way fevers on the frontier always seemed to, swiftly, indiscriminately, and without any regard for how carefully a household kept its accounts or how devoutly its members prayed. Elias sat with her for 11 days, sponging her forehead with well water, reading to her from the same worn Bible her mother had given her, and holding her hand through nights so cold the water in the basin froze by morning. She died on the 12th day, quietly, just before dawn, and Elias buried her in the small cemetery east of town beneath a modest stone he could barely afford to carve, and for a long while afterward he moved through his days the way a man moves through water, slowly, with effort, feeling the world's ordinary sounds arrive muffled and strange. Grief alone might have been survivable. Grief combined with 3 years of drought and a mortgage payment that had quietly, almost imperceptibly, grown beyond his capacity to meet, was not. Nathaniel Pruitt came to see him in March, dressed in a fine wool coat entirely unsuited to a condolence call, and explained with practiced sympathy that the bank could no longer extend the grace period it had shown him, that the note was due, and that if payment could not be made in full within 30 days the bank would be obliged, with genuine regret, to take possession of both the shop and the house. Elias asked, quietly, whether there might be some arrangement, some extended term, given the years he had banked with the institution and the reputation he had built in the county. Pruitt's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went flat and final, and he said only that the bank's obligations were to all its depositors equally and could not bend for sentiment. 30 days later, Elias Bonner watched a stranger's furniture being carried into the house he had built with Sarah and walked out of Cedar Hollow's business district for what he assumed would be the last time, carrying his father's blacksmithing tools, a bedroll, and considerably less money than the situation warranted a man having earned after 11 years of honest work. He spent the following months doing what broken men on the frontier have always done, hiring out for day wages wherever a farm needed an extra hand, mending harness and tools in exchange for meals, sleeping in barns that were not his own, and waking before their owners so as not to overstay a welcome he had not quite been granted. It was in this condition, threadbare and unmoored, that Elias found himself back in Cedar Hollow in the third week of August, drawn there not by any plan but by the vague, aimless pull a man feels toward the place where his life once had shape. The county was holding one of its regular auctions that week, liquidating properties abandoned or forfeited over the preceding year, and Elias wandered into the yard behind the courthouse mostly to watch, the way a man watches a fire he is no longer close enough to be warmed by. He had $4.60 to his name, money earned threshing wheat for a farmer 3 counties over, and no intention whatsoever of spending it. Lot after lot went to bidders he recognized, grain speculators, a few of the town's more prosperous merchants, and, more than once, agents bidding quietly on Nathaniel Pruitt's behalf, since the bank had, in the years since it foreclosed on Elias's home, become the county's most aggressive accumulator of failed properties. And then, as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the crowd thinned toward its final lots, the auctioneer read out a parcel description that made something in Elias's memory stir, faint and half-formed, like a name heard once in childhood. The old Alcott barn, at the western edge of town, condemned by the county surveyor as structurally unsound, sold as is, buyer responsible for demolition or removal. No one wanted it. The barn had stood empty and unused for the better part of 2 decades, its roof sagging under snow it had never been properly cleared of, its siding gray and split with weather, its foundation, according to the county notice, unstable enough that most of the men gathered that afternoon considered it not property, but liability. A structure whose only remaining value was however much scrap lumber a man might salvage before it collapsed on its own. The auctioneer, sensing no interest, made a joke about paying someone to haul it away rather than selling it, and it was in the small laugh that followed, and in the sudden, sharp memory of Sarah's voice telling him about a blacksmith named Josiah Alcott on a cold evening years before, that Elias raised his hand and said, before he had entirely decided to, that he would take it for $5. The auctioneer, still chuckling, gavelled it down without further bidding, and several men nearby shook their heads with the particular pity reserved for a man everyone assumed grief had finally unhinged. Elias paid his $5, took his bill of sale, and walked the half-mile to the western edge of town to look, for the first time in his adult life, at the barn his wife had once spoken of with such quiet, unresolved trouble in her voice. It was, even in its ruin, an impressive structure. Whatever else had happened to Josiah Alcott, the man had built to last, and the barn's timber frame, heavy oak beams joined with the kind of mortise and tenon craftsmanship few builders bothered with anymore, had clearly outlasted whatever neglect 30 years of Cedar Hollow's indifference had subjected it to. Elias spent that first evening simply walking its length, running his hand along beams silvered with age, noting with a wheelwright's practiced eye the quality of the joinery, the care with which the loft had been framed, the way the whole structure, for all its sagging roof and rotted siding, still held itself with a kind of stubborn dignity. He slept that night in the barn's driest corner, on a bed of old straw, and it was near midnight, unable to sleep, restless with the particular restlessness of a man circling in old grief, that he noticed something odd about the floor of the barn's smaller side room, a section once used, he guessed, for tack or feed storage. The floorboards there did not run the same direction as the rest of the barn's flooring. and when he knelt and pressed his palm against them, one section gave, ever so slightly, with a hollow sound entirely different from the solid thunk of the boards around it. It took him the better part of an hour, working by lantern light with a pry bar borrowed from his own meager tool roll, to work the boards loose, and when he finally lifted the third one free, he found himself looking down into a shallow chamber, perhaps 2 feet deep, lined with fitted stone and dry as a bone despite the decades of prairie weather that had passed above it. Inside sat an iron strongbox, rusted at its hinges but intact, and beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a bundle of papers that Elias, hands trembling now more from anticipation than from the night's chill, lifted out with the same careful reverence his father had once handled hot iron. The strongbox, when he finally forced its corroded latch, held gold and silver coin totaling a sum that made Elias sit back hard against the barn wall and simply breathe for a long moment. Not a fortune by the standards of the bankers who had begun building brick offices along Cedar Hollow's main street, but far more than a ruined man with $4 to his name had any right to expect, and clearly, from the care with which it had been hidden, money someone had considered too important to spend carelessly. The papers proved harder to make sense of by lantern light, but even a first careful reading told Elias he had stumbled onto something considerably more significant than buried coin. There were ledgers, kept in a strong, careful hand, recording sums of money, dozens of small loans, some no larger than $10 or $15, extended over a period of years to families whose names Elias did not recognize, each entry marked, without exception, as repaid or forgiven. There were letters, several of them, written in that same hand and addressed to Josiah Alcott, thanking him for tools lent, for debts covered, for a barn loft that had sheltered a family through a hard winter when no one else in the county would take in freedmen seeking to homestead. And there was a final document, folded separately and sealed with wax that had cracked but not entirely broken, which Elias, his hands unsteady in the lantern light, recognized after several confused readings as something far more dangerous than money, a set of land deeds, and a sworn statement, notarized in 1876, describing how the very land upon which much of Cedar Hollow's prosperous business district now stood, including, Elias realized with a slow, cold understanding, the building that presently housed the Cedar Hollow Farmers and Merchants Bank, had originally been surveyed, filed, and rightfully patented in the name of Josiah Alcott, before a young, ambitious land agent named Nathaniel Pruitt's own father had orchestrated, through a combination of forged transfer documents and a deliberately mismanaged tax auction, the quiet theft of nearly the entire parcel. Elias sat in that hollowed-out room until dawn, reading the same papers over and over by the failing light of his lantern, understanding gradually that he was holding, quite literally, the buried proof of how an entire town's foundation of respectable prosperity had been built upon a theft nobody living had ever been made to answer for. He understood, too, with a clarity that felt almost physical in his chest, why Josiah Alcott had hidden this proof rather than simply confronting the men who had wronged him. A black landowner in 1876 Kansas, however skilled and however respected among his own community, would have found precious little justice in a county courthouse controlled by the very men who had swindled him. And Alcott had evidently understood that his safest course was to preserve the truth for a future, in which it might finally matter, rather than risk his family's safety chasing a justice the present would not grant him. What Elias did not yet know, sitting alone in that barn as the sun rose gray and gold over the prairie, was whether such a future had finally arrived, or whether Cedar Hollow, 30 years on, would prove no more willing to face this truth than it had been the first time. The days that followed tested that question more directly than Elias could have anticipated. Word travels fast in a small town, and word that the ruined wheelwright had bought the old Alcott barn and been seen at the courthouse asking the county clerk pointed questions about decades-old land filings reached Nathaniel Pruitt with unusual speed. Pruitt came to see him personally, this time finding Elias at the barn itself, dressed once again in a coat too fine for the errand, his manner still smooth, but carrying now an undercurrent Elias had not detected in their previous encounters, something watchful, something calculating the size of a threat. Pruitt offered, with an ease that made the offer feel more like a warning than a kindness, to buy the barn back from Elias for $50, a sum 10 times what Elias had paid, framing it as a neighborly gesture toward a man who had clearly suffered enough hardship without wasting further effort on a condemned building the county intended to demolish regardless. Elias, who had not yet told anyone what he had found, understood immediately and with total certainty that this offer was not generosity but fear, and he declined it, politely but without hesitation, and watched something behind Pruitt's practiced smile go cold and hard in a way that confirmed, more than any document could have, exactly how much the banker had to lose. What followed was not violence, for Pruitt was too careful a man for anything so crude, but a quieter, more insidious campaign of pressure that Elias recognized, with a wheelwright's grim understanding of mechanisms, as the deliberate application of leverage. Farmers who had been willing to hire Elias for day labor suddenly found they had no work to spare. A feed merchant who had extended him credit for his mule abruptly called the debt due in full. The county surveyor, previously cooperative, became suddenly unavailable whenever Elias sought to confirm the old land filings against the current courthouse records, and Elias understood that Pruitt, whose bank held notes on half the businesses in Cedar Hollow, had simply begun calling in favors and applying quiet threats to isolate him. The same slow economic strangulation that had cost Elias his home in the first place, now deployed with considerably more urgency. It would have been easy, in those weeks, for Elias to have simply sold what he had found for whatever price Pruitt was willing to pay and disappeared west with enough money to start over quietly. And there were nights, cold and doubting, when he came close to exactly that. But he kept returning, in his mind, to his father's voice at the forge. Nothing is finished being useful until somebody decides it is, and to Sarah's voice on those long winter evenings, troubled by a story the town had chosen to forget, and he found that he could not, in good conscience, become one more man who decided a wrong done to the Alcott family was simply too inconvenient to make right. He went, instead, to Mrs. Odom, the elderly widow who had told Sarah the fragments of this story years before, and found her still living, still sharp-minded despite her failing eyes, in a small house at the edge of town. She confirmed what the papers had already told him, adding details no document could have, that Josiah Alcott had a daughter, Naomi, who had been a girl of perhaps 12 when the family lost their land and left Cedar Hollow, and who had, according to letters Mrs. Odom had exchanged with the family over the years before old age made correspondence difficult, eventually settled in Topeka, married, and raised a family of her own, never once returning to the town that had erased her father's name from its history. It took Elias nearly 3 weeks, working through the county's postal service and a lawyer in Topeka willing to help for a modest fee paid from the recovered strongbox, to locate Naomi Alcott Reeves, now a woman in her middle years, still living in Topeka, and to arrange, with considerable care, given how thin the trust between them necessarily was at first, a meeting at which he could explain what he had found beneath her father's barn. Naomi Reeves arrived in Cedar Hollow on a warm September morning, and Elias watched her stand at the edge of what remained of her father's land, looking at the barn he had built with his own hands, for a long, silent while before she spoke at all. What followed was not, in the end, a simple matter of handing over money and documents, however much Elias might have wished the resolution could be so clean. Nathaniel Pruitt, confronted publicly with the notarized statement and the original land patent, which Elias and the Topeka lawyer had by then filed properly with the county recorder, did not confess or apologize. Men like Pruitt rarely do. He fought the claim through every legal maneuver available to him, hired lawyers from as far as Kansas City, and spent a considerable sum of the bank's money attempting to have the old documents declared fraudulent or the statute of limitations declared expired. But the documents were genuine, notarized by a judge whose own signature the county still had on file, and witnessed by 3 men whose descendants, once located, confirmed the family stories they had always half believed but never been able to prove. The county court, after a proceeding that stretched across the better part of a year and drew newspaper attention from as far away as Lawrence, ultimately ruled that while the passage of decades made full restitution of the original parcel impractical, given the businesses now operating upon it in good faith. The Alcott family was entitled to significant financial compensation from the bank that had profited from the fraud, a sum that, combined with what Elias had recovered from the strongbox itself, restored to Naomi Reeves and her children a measure of the security her grandfather's theft had stolen from 3 generations of her family. Nathaniel Pruitt did not go to prison, for the law of that place and time offered little appetite for punishing a respectable banker for his father's decades-old sins, however clearly proven. But the ruling broke him in the way such men are most vulnerable to being broken, publicly, and in the coin he valued most. Depositors who had trusted the Cedar Hollow Farmers and Merchants Bank withdrew their accounts in numbers the institution could not survive, and within 18 months Pruitt had sold his interest and left the county entirely, his name mentioned afterward in Cedar Hollow only in the lowered voices reserved for cautionary tales. Elias, for his part, wanted none of the fame the newspapers tried briefly to attach to him, and used his own modest share of the recovered fortune not to rebuild the shop and house he had lost, though he might easily have, but to help Naomi Reeves establish a fund, administered jointly with the county, that repaired the town's aging schoolhouse, rebuilt the small church that had served Cedar Hollow's earliest black families before the congregation scattered, and quietly restored the barn itself, which still stands today, a working structure once more, on land that finally, properly, bears the Alcott name on its deed. We began this story with a broken man standing in a dusty auction yard, buying for $5 a building everyone else had already decided was worthless. We told you then that Elias Bonner had lost nearly everything the world could take from a man: his wife, his home, his trade, his standing among neighbors who had once tipped their hats to him, and that he stood that August afternoon with almost nothing left but the strange, stubborn instinct his father had planted in him decades before, that nothing is finished being useful until somebody decides it is. What Elias found beneath that barn's false floor was never simply gold, though the gold mattered, and it was never simply justice, though the justice mattered more. What he found, and what he ultimately gave back to a family that had waited 30 years without ever fully losing hope, was proof that their loss had been real, that it had been wrong, and that somewhere, someone had cared enough to preserve the truth of it against a day when the truth might finally be believed. Elias Bonner never became a wealthy man by the town's old measure, and he never rebuilt the exact life he'd had with Sarah, because some things, once lost, simply cannot be rebuilt in their original shape. But he became, in the years that followed, the kind of man his father had always tried to teach him to be, a man who understood that the most overlooked things, whether a bent horseshoe, a condemned barn, or a family's stolen history, are very often waiting only for someone willing to look closely enough to see what they are actually worth. Thank you for spending this time with us and with the story of Elias Bonner. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need reminding that what the world discards is not always without value. And consider staying with us a little longer, since we have many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Before you go, we would love to know, has there ever been a moment in your own life when you found real worth in something everyone else had already written off? We read every story you leave us, and we treasure them more than you might guess. Until next time, stay close.